Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Learn Live session on Azure OpenAI application, identity, and security. I'm Lisette Peña de Sola. I'm a senior customer engineer in Fast Track for Azure at Microsoft. I work with customers that want to adopt Azure technologies, and my specialty is identity and access management, as well as security in the cloud. With me, I have Bappa Banerjee. He's a senior customer engineer. I'll let Bappa introduce himself. Bappa, over to you.
Thank you, Lizette. Hi, my name is Bappa Banerjee. I'm a senior engineer within Fast Track of Azure Group, same group as Lizette. So my primary expertise is also identity, other PaaS services such as app service, APIM, and we from Fast Track Group we help our customers to move their workloads to Azure, remove all kind of blockers. So today I'll be looking forward to discuss with you, Lizette, regarding the Azure OpenAI application identity and security.
Awesome. So you have the URL to our Learn Live session at the top of the slide, but I also want to introduce you to James Croft. He's a customer engineer on the Fast Track for Azure team. James is also specializing in identity and access management and security. He will be our moderator, so kudos to James for leading that effort. Any questions you have, you may put the questions in the chat, and James will tackle those questions real time. James has worked with us on all the content that will be part of the session today. And any questions that he thinks that we may demo and will be more effective to do it through a demo or in both Bob and myself, he'll just forward those to us and we'll tackle those real time. So feel free to put as many questions as you like in the chat. Let's go ahead and show you resources we also publish for today's session. So you have the URL to the Learn Live collection that will have a lot of the materials and references that will allow you to go deeper into the subject. Azure OpenAI is very useful when you're creating intelligent applications. So we put together a collection of resources, webinars as part of the official collection with this webinar. You can use the QR code on the screen for that as well. So let's give this a go. So what are we going to learn about today? As we know, Azure OpenAI allows two types of authentication. So you can have EntraID authentication or use API keys. However, we want to present to you other ways to authenticate and authorize end users that will use intelligent applications. We want to ensure you know how to register your Azure OpenAI API and how to grant permissions to certain scopes, how to validate JWT tokens that are issued by identity providers, not only by EntraID. We want to show you a solution that uses managed identities to authenticate users. And we can show you how to extend the architecture to allow other large language model services that are not Azure OpenAI. So if you bring or host a different LLM service, how to authenticate with those, and also how to use external IdPs that are not EntraID. So any IdP that can use OIDC protocol or can use federated identity, there is a way to also use those to authenticate end users. So if we are ready to go, we are also ready to go. Let's see what this is all about. Now, generative AI services, such as OpenAI, can funnel intelligent applications and provide AI services through API gateways. Now, when you have that, you can use alternative authentication mechanisms that are not the ones that are provided by Azure OpenAI out of the box. That way, you can extend your solution and cover more scenarios for authentication. We will demonstrate to you how to implement these solutions using a gateway. It could be APIM, like Azure API services, but management services, but it could be also an API gateway implementation other than APIM, or one that you can build yourself and bring over. So let's look at the impediments. So Azure OpenAI by default supports two forms of authentication. One of them is using Microsoft Entra ID, and this is a keyless way of authenticating with the Azure OpenAI instance, but also supports API keys. API keys is a secondary, with a primary and secondary key can be provided to the client application to authenticate through the HTTPS request to the backend service. Now, key-based authentication requires that each client will have a copy of the key and will have to securely manage and store the key. Now, as you may know, when you have public applications like web applications or mobile applications, the security of the key may not be guaranteed. So making key-based authentication less desirable than using identity providers such as EntraID, mostly because of the key rotation scenarios that you have to take into account and the proper secure storage of the key. So let's look at these issues more in depth before we jump into the solutions.
And Lizette, what I'm thinking
Yes.
that for our customer, knowledge, like if you could explain what is managed identity in Azure and how, maybe we will discuss in later in detail, but if you can just touch base the brief part
Absolutely.
of the what is managed identity.
Yes, so let's pause a little bit on what a managed identity is. So managed identity is a concept in Azure that it allows you to issue an identity to a service running in Azure that will in turn authenticate against an EntraID to obtain an access token to authenticate itself with another service. So you issue a managed identity to an Azure service that will uniquely identify that service, and you can grant access to that managed identity to a backend service. It could be an API, it could be a database, to services in Azure that support that. The drawback is that the managed identity is for Azure hosted services. So when you have an external hosted application, then that may not be suitable for a managed identity. And there are two types of managed identities: the user assigned managed identity, in which you have one service that can call several, one client, I'm sorry, that can call several services. And there is a one-to-one relationship. There is a one-to-many relationships. And there's also a system assigned managed identity. And in this case, there is a one client to one service relationship. And the managed identity, the life cycle of that managed identity is linked to the life cycle of the client that it was issued for. So in that case, you have less overhead with maintenance. But we will show you later on when to use a managed identity, what type of managed identity, and what problem we'll be solving with managed identities.
Sure.
Okay,
Thank you, Lizette.
yeah. No, great call, Baba. Alrighty, so let's see what would be the first scenario for the problems we're trying to solve. So when you integrate your solution with Azure OpenAI, you have the challenge that if your application is using a different identity provider other than Microsoft Entra ID, then you cannot authenticate out of the box with Azure OpenAI services, because Azure OpenAI services requires an Entra ID tenant. Now, in that case, you could revert to API key authentication, but as we mentioned before, that may not align with the desired security requirements. You may have issues storing the key securely on your application. Distributing the key is another issue. Key rotation could be an issue as well. And you will have one one or two keys for the service that will represent the calls from several users. So in that case, you won't have detailed claims or detailed attributes describing either the application or the end users. So there are a few drawbacks to use just API key authentication. So that this is one of the scenarios we're trying to solve with our solution. So let's the use of external identities and the use of API keys as the single form of authentication, because in that case you don't represent the end users fairly well.
And there is a risk of there is a security risk here as well, is that right? So if you
Absolutely.
like wanted to provide, if I want to implement, if any customer wants to implement like multiple intelligent app, they need to provide the API keys to all their apps, and then so there can be a chance that the keys can be leaked, or so so that uh, so this is
Yes.
the. Mhm.
Yeah, so the surface of attack is definitely larger when you're reusing the same keys across several intelligent applications. So in the picture, we have depicted only one intelligent application, but that's rarely the case. You usually have several intelligent applications talking to a backend API. And in that case, if you use an API key and you reuse it across client applications, that increases the risk for man-in-the-middle attacks, for a key replay, and so on. So that's why the security requirements in this case are not, it's not as secure as if you were to have other mechanisms for authenticating and authorizing users. So good call, Bappa. Let's see then another problem we have. So in this case, if you have multiple client applications and you want to have alternative authentication mechanisms, so can you use something other than Microsoft Entra ID? Let's say you have another identity provider that implements OIDC and the federated identity pattern, then what will be available for those applications that do not use Microsoft Entra ID? Um, and again, we said that we could revert to API keys, but as we know, there are drawbacks of using API keys from the security standpoint. What if you also need alternative credential mechanisms like digital certificates? What if you want to utilize client digital certificates as a way to authenticating end users? Or what if you need to have several mechanisms to authenticate users on your different intelligent applications? So in that case, that's scenario number two, that you have multiple applications. You don't want to revert necessarily to API keys because that will increase your attack surface. That will increase the man in the middle or adversary in the middle attacks. And you want to also use other mechanisms like digital certificates and be able to authenticate across multiple client applications. So what are the alternatives on that case? And one of the issues with API keys, as we noted before, is when you rotate them and reissue the keys, if you have several intelligent applications, then you have to redistribute those keys across several applications. So that's another consideration when you use just API keys. And you want to give the ability to intelligent applications that are hosted in Azure a way to use managed identities, because managed identities offer a secure way of authentication in which your intelligent application is issued an access token to present to the service under because it's issued by Entra ID and issued only for the application and only for the specific scope, that can also increase the security of your solution. So let's look at.
And it's okay.
Mhm.
No, what I was
No.
just saying that it's not much
Mhm.
scalable, even if you are using the Azure hosted managed identity for your Azure hosted intelligent applications. So if you
Mhm.
like wanted to connect more intelligent Azure hosted intelligent application to Azure OpenAI services, we have to enable the manage identity for each app to the Azure OpenAI. So the
Correct.
each app has to enable the manage identity, and that manage identity has to assign it the Azure OpenAI service. So that's kind of gives more complexity, uh, you know, to the
Absolutely.
implementation. Mhm.
That's a great call. That means that you'll have, as you increase the number of Azure hosted intelligent applications, you'll have more managed identities associated to each one of those client applications, and therefore your administrative overhead will increase as well.
Right. Yep.
Mhm. Okay, so what happens when you also, this is the third problem we're trying to solve, is when you have disparate generative AI services. So not only you have Azure OpenAI as a backend, but you have other generative AI services that are not Azure OpenAI, but that your intelligent applications also consume. So it's not only one service. You may have bring your own LLM service, if you will. So in that case, when you have multiple AI services, the complexity of managing multiple APIs and potentially the complexity of having different authentication mechanisms for each API can increase the complexity of the overall solution. So you want to ensure that the different AI services, if they require different methods for authentication, they can be achieved with minimum complexity. So in this case, Azure OpenAI may use um, uh, API keys, but other open source may require better tokens and not work with API keys. And in this case, the token acquisition, the refresh of the tokens, and also the token validation and management are keys for the overall solution. Now, rotating credentials when you have keys, or having two or more mechanisms for authentication can increase the complexity of the solution you have to implement on your intelligent application. So we're trying to simplify that complexity by introducing a solution that will make the intelligent application see the API a simpler way. However, that simpler way will still be secure. And I'm not sure if we have questions so far. I hope James is tackling those, but let us know if you want us to um, address any question in the chat. So let's look at solutions then. And on this presentation, we'll also show you real life or demos on how to implement an API gateway. But the use of intelligent applications, you can authenticate with an identity provider and validate the authenticity of the tokens that are issued for the intelligent application using an API gateway. So this is the pattern we want to introduce, the use of an API gateway that will directly communicate with the generative AI services and will handle the different managed authentication mechanisms. So that way it will outsource the responsibility of validating the different authentication mechanisms to this API rather than having it on the back end or adding that complexity into the intelligent application. So that's the successful outcome that we're trying to achieve today. And here's our solution. So as you can see, we added an API management service. Notice that the API gateway, I'm sorry that it went to the wrong slide. It can be the Azure API management service, but notice that the API gateway, as long as you know the roles and responsibilities it will have, it can be another API gateway, and it can also be implemented from scratch. So in this case, what we want to achieve is having the user authentication and authorization with the AI service via an API gateway. So what is the API gateway going to give us? Well, first of all, you can use an identity provider that we actually recommend Microsoft Entra ID, but it could be an external identity provider. So if the identity provider implements the federated identity and can implement the OIDC protocol, then we can definitely use that on our client application to authenticate end users and to obtain access token for the backend service. In this case, the API gateway will handle the authentication with a generative AI service using the most secure authentication mechanism. And for instance, if it's Azure Microsoft Entra ID, then it will utilize the access tokens for the Azure OpenAI service, or it could be API key based, the mechanism between API management and the generative AI that doesn't support tokens. Now, why do we recommend an identity provider? First of all, the federation identity pattern, it's one that we've seen adopted throughout the enterprises. The issuance of an access token can improve the security of your applications. Your applications are no longer in charge of storing username and passwords or issuing tickets or secure token act as secure token providers. In this case, all that is achieved by using an identity provider. In this case, the application will be registered with the identity provider the same way as the backend service or the OpenAI service can also be registered with identity provider, and it can expose a specific scope for the client application. And at that point, you grant your intelligent application access to a particular scope for the service, improving the security of the service and issuing fine-grained claims for the end users. So in that case, the identity provider will ensure the secure scope is requested, and it will issue claims identifying the application and identifying the end users. Based on these claims, you can then do further validation at the API management level. And if the claims are not present, if the token is expired, or if it was issued for another service rather than the backend service it's trying to reach, then that request will be unauthorized right away and it won't reach the backend. So that's one of the advantages of using an identity provider. There are also several advantages with regards to security. First of all, the tokens are digitally signed. So the claims that are in the token, you can validate the digital signature of the token to ensure it wasn't tampered in transit. Digital signature validation can be computationally expensive. So that's something you can definitely outsource to your API management service. And the API gateway will be the one in charge to validate that token. And token validation can be something that, especially the digital signature validation, can the API management gateway can access the public keys for the identity provider, calculate the hash of the token, decrypt the hash of the token that comes as part of the token, and compare the calculated hash versus the hash that the token brings. And if the hash is matched, then that token is valid. It wasn't tampered in transit. And that's one of the ways to mitigate the man in the middle or adversary in the middle attacks. Tokens are also issued for a short period of time. So if a token gets compromised, the replay only has a certain period of time until the token expires to be reused. And with the API management, the API gateway can also be aware of token replays. So if a token is reused several times, that's something that can be cached at the API gateway. So let's look at another advantage of having an API management service as part of the solution. Let's say you want another OIDC identity provider that is not EntraID. Let's say you have an Okta on your enterprise space or any other OIDC provider. You, if you were to use directly Azure OpenAI service, then you know you need an EntraID tenant. But if you don't want to use that identity provider and want to use another OIDC provider, then definitely you by using an API management or an API gateway that will be in charge of validating those access tokens or JWT tokens, then you can use that by having the API management or API gateway if you're not using APIM, validate the tokens that are issued for the OpenAI service. So in this case, you can adopt a third-party identity provider. You're not bound to use only EntraID as long as the identity provider can use OIDC protocol, issue JWT tokens, then you're good to go, and you can then use the um, API gateway to validate those tokens and streamline the authentication process. So notice that when you're using an identity provider, it is key to register the application, the client application, and the web API or the um, OpenAI service or the generative AI service. You must register those with the identity provider and grant the intelligent application during the registration process access to the backend API and access to specific scopes for this API. So this is what we're going to demo next. Let's, I'm going to pass it over to Baba. Excuse me. So we're going to demonstrate user authentication and authorization using Microsoft Entra ID and how to register that as well. So Baba, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Lizette, for explaining so great. So it was great explanation. So before I start the demo or whatever Lizette you explained, so I'll just quickly show the setup what I have. So first, if you see that Azure OpenAI, so I created an Azure OpenAI instance using the Azure portal, as you all probably know that how to do it. So if you see this, I created Azure OpenAI workspace, and it has a keys and endpoints. So you can see the so keys and you can see the keys and the endpoints, and you can open that Azure OpenAI Studio, Azure OpenAI Studio from there as well. So as you see that I deployed a model. I deployed few models, GPT-35 Turbo, the Turbo 60K, and this is a playground we have in the OpenAI Studio where you can really, chat with chat with your LLM. So you can ask any question and stuff. But ideally, you don't like your users are not chatting from the Azure portal, right? So you have to build an intelligent applications, as Lizette you were explaining. The application can be hosted in Azure or it can be hosted in somewhere else, some other cloud provider or your some on-prem your hosted applications, but that needs to interact with your Azure OpenAI. And today's topic is we wanted to show you that how you can the authenticate and authorization. You can put the authentication and authorization on top of Azure OpenAI. So this is my Azure OpenAI Studio setup, Azure OpenAI workspace setup. And the other thing what I did was the API management. So I created an API management instance. As you can see this. As Lizette, as you explained, this can be any other API gateway, but since we are in Azure, so our solution for the API gateway is the API management service. So as you know that API management service has a component called API gateway, which actually handles the request and response of all the API requests and sends to the backend, as well as like interaction between backends and the client application. So here, if you see this APIs, so I imported the Azure OpenAI API. So I imported through the very like the regular Open API specs. So I created the Open API specs based on my Azure OpenAI. And if you see this, so I will explain that why I created two with manage identity and with manage identity and with key. But so to see this, if you see this, so this is my web service URL. So basically the backend URL is going to this service URL, and I have a API URL suffix. So your front end consumer will have to pass like the full URL with the suffix and stuff. So this is pretty standard. And if you see the design, you have a backend, you have a place where you can put the policies and stuff. So those are there in the, so if you see that I have policies, and I will explain that what the policies is for. As Lizette was explaining, there are many ways to authenticate. One is the through key, and another one is the manage identity that we could handle it in the API management itself. But to do that, your client application needs to be authenticated with some kind of auth provider or some kind of identity provider, right? And in this case, what I am going to show you the using the Entra ID, how your client provider gets some access token, and pass this token to the API management service, and our APIM can validate that token and validate the basically validate your client applications or your user that hey, this is a valid request, and then from that onwards it can route your request to the backend as your OpenAI and get the completion request and all stuff, as you know that. So our Azure OpenAI have different type of endpoints, which is the completion and chat endpoints, where you can pass the your system prompts and user prompts, and you get the response back. So here is my basic setup. Now my next setup is Entra ID. As Lizette, you explained that we have to register in the Entra ID, we have to register the client tab. So if I go to this,
Papa, and one quick question for app registration. Is there anything specific that we need to know for our solution versus the regular app registration in Entra ID?
so for it's nothing different. So what I will show you, Lizette, that there are ways, Entra ID, where we can do like we can register two apps, one for our front end and the another one is for our back end, which represents the Azure OpenAI, or in our case it's our APIM itself, and you can control the scope and stuff. So if you see that. Um, the way I register, that's a good question, Lizette, because that's why we are showing it, that how you can control the authentication and authorization using the uh, Entra ID app registration. So as part of that, I registered the front end as your OpenAI, very regular way how you do the app registration. And if you see this, I have the authentication which I enabled, and I will be showing you to from my Postman, but it can be your any of your web app which can be registered in Azure, which can be registered in somewhere else. So you just need to register your redirect URIs here. And if you wanted to use the client credential, you can have mailing flows there. You wanted to use the client credentials flow, you have to configure the client secret and stuff. And before I jump into the API permission, let me go to the my other app registration which I registered. And if you see this backend as your OpenAI, very same registration, the followed the same thing. The this app is basically controlling the authorization part. Now, if you go to this expose an API tab, so what I did was I exposed the application AID URI and added a scope. So there are two ways basically to control the authorization part. So one is the scope and the other one is the role. I can show you the role part as well in the front end app. So in the scope, so if you see this, I created a scope. It's an OpenAI.chat, and the scope URI is there. So it's all set up in my backend as your OpenAI. Now there are many scope you can create it. Like if you wanted to give the only your some APIs, or maybe the read access or write access to the some of calls, write access to your APIs, you can control through your scope. So this is basically your authorization. And the way what you do is, after you exposing the scope here, go to your front end app and go to API permission. and added the scope. So basically you add a permission. I already added it, and then you find your APIs, and you add the scope. And if you see this I have added my backend Azure OpenAI scope here. So now all setup is done. But the other way is the app roles. If you can enable the app roles for your front end app, and then app roles can be added as an API permission, as an application permission. So this is a delegated permission. So basically customer needs to, like your user, like when they are logging in your application, they need to pass this openai.chat as a scope, so it will be part of the claim. So I'll show you that in a minute. But the other ways is the app roles, which will be the application permission, and you can associate the app roles in here as well. So in that way you can control the authorization part. Now,
Good call.
yeah, so if I jump over here, now this is what today I will be showing using the Postman. But as I explained, it can be your web app. So ultimately, you will not be doing your through your Postman, right? So you should be able to do it any of your web app using .NET or any single page applications. We have a lot of samples available. You can see that how you can authenticate and authorize your users um, to and using Entra ID. But as Lizette, as you explained, that it can be any auth provider. It's nothing with, since we are demoing Entra ID, but it's not limited with the Entra ID. As you see that I am using the authorization code Pixie Flow, and I just have to the configure here. Where is my access token URL, my tenant URL, my client ID. This is my client ID of the front end client application, my client secret of my front end client application. Backend client is nowhere here, like for the client ID and client secret. And here in the scope, where I need to pass it from my application is the scope which I wanted to have it for this particular authentication. So now, if you get a new access token, so from your app, it will be very similar. You will, like, user will sign in, and it will redirect to, since I'm already, it's my single sign-on with my Microsoft ID. It did not ask me, but if I would have done with the incognito window, it would have asked me my user ID and credentials and MFA and all kind of stuff. But since I am already logged in using the Azure portal, my user, it took my user ID and password and generated an access token.
So
Uh,
that's why we're not seeing the credential challenge. 'Cause you're already logged in or signed in.
that is right. So you see that when login.microsoftonline.com, which redirects to the login.microsoftonline.com, this URL, to get the access token. I'm already signed in, and then it's kind of um, it signed me in using me ID, and then just pass the use token here, so to the postman. And if you see this, and this is what important to understand, that the importance of the token. This is a JWT token. It's assigned, it's encrypted as well. So and so if you see the things, see the audience is, what is my audience is, like, audience is the application ID of my backend URI. Now let me show you this 6E745. So if I go back to my backend Azure OpenAI, and if you see, so you see this application ID URI, which is basically the part of the scope. The scope URL is API colon / and then this openai.chat, and this came as a scope. So if you go to here jwt.ms, and you see the SCP openai.chat, and that this scope, you can have multiple scope. As I said, you can have for your read write access. Basically it is giving an authorization to the user, hey, you are authenticated. Like if you see that my name came up here as a given name, since I'm already authenticated, so my unique the email address came in the claim as well as it's giving me the SCP claim in the token, that, hey, I am authorized to, and also the audience claim, I am authorized to call the Azure OpenAI. Now that can be validated in our API gateway. So that is the at least that, as you explained, that's the benefit of our having an API gateway, so that you have a middleware where you are validating this token. You can validate the scope, you can validate the audience and all stuff. So I'll show you all these things how we could validate in the next demo. But
Yeah.
for now, it's
And
kind of just wanted to show that how the token is being generated by the front end app.
great. And Baba, if you leave the token there, so these claims, as Baba mentioned, can be validated. In the case of APIM, we can create a policy to validate the JWT token, ensure that the proper claims are part of the token. And what is more important is the digital signature validation. So this is something that is computationally expensive, because you're decrypting the third part of the token. So as you can see, the token has three distinct portions. So it has a header that shows you the hashing algorithm that is used to generate the digital signature. It has the payload portion that has the main claims um, or assertions that are issued when the token is issued for the end user and the application. And it has the digital signature that is the encrypted hash that is calculated for the token. So the digital signature validation entails to calculate that hash with the algorithm that shows on the header, decrypt the hash that comes with the token, and then compare the calculated hash versus the hash that comes with the token to ensure they're the same. If they're not the same, then it means that something changed along the way, because this token can traverse the internet if you don't have a private link, or you're not on express route, and there could be some anyone with a proxy trying to manipulate and modify the token. We see that in token replace, or when people want to after starting the middle attacks, that they want to increase the access you have. So that's why the signature validation ensures that there hasn't been any tampering um, while the token goes through, is in transit, and before reaching the API gateway. So this
Perfect.
is
That's
great
a
to
great
have.
explanation, Lizette, and a great explanation of the benefit of the JWT token and how it works, So this is, uh, yeah, so this is really kind of, making it your application more secure by using this JWT token, using the OAuth provider. EntraID is one of our identity OAuth provider from Microsoft.
Great. So let's look at
Over to you,
the
Lizette, for the presentation, and then from the next demo, I'll get for the next demo.
Sounds good. So let's look at the way of validating then the intelligent application requests. So let's see, as we mentioned, OIDC as a protocol, would be one of the recommended ways to ensure security and to ensure the integrity of the user authentication within the intelligent application. And nowadays, a lot of intelligent applications, or a lot of web applications and mobile applications, already use OIDC. There is quite a few OIDC libraries for that. However, by only using OIDC is not enough. You do need, as I mentioned before, to have a validation at the gateway level of those tokens to ensure that the request is for a given service and not other, that the token is actually not expired, so you have an expiration date. Also, that the token is not used before a given date, so that will minimize the replay attacks. And gateways can also connect to the OpenID metadata endpoint for the identity provider. And that way they can also obtain the latest metadata on the for the identity provider and get the public keys that the private key was used to generate the cryptographic digital signature for the token. So by accessing the OpenID discovery metadata endpoint, you guarantee that the API gateway has the latest information on the identity provider and has the latest set of the public key from the public private key pair. And one key function of the API management service is the guaranteeing that you're validating the scope, also guaranteeing that you're authorizing the proper client application, because you have the client application that the token was issued for, and that you're dealing with the proper identity provider, because if you're using the metadata endpoint from the identity provider you expect, but you're actually the token is actually issued by a different identity provider, then you won't be able to validate signature. So that's another check to do. Now, in the aspect of token validation, first you'll have a centralized validation mechanism, right? So you're offloading all that validation process that is computationally expensive. You're offloading that from the downstream services into an API gateway that simplifies the maintenance of the security checks, ensures that the security checks will be in place for every single request. You can also perform optimization. So you can cache the public keys, for instance. You can also cache validated tokens. You can reduce the overhead of subsequent requests. You can also do other validations, like you can ensure throttling or limit the quotas for your services. That's another aspect of having an API gateway. And you can have security policies that will enforce access control to a fine grain based on the token claims. For example, you can authorize based on user roles. So if you have claims on your token that will describe the user role, that will give you permissions to a certain scope. You can also have custom claims on your token that will describe your end user. You can validate the audience, as we saw in the on the demo. The audience claim is will describe what the token is intended for, and very importantly, the revocation and expiration dates for the cost for the token. It will prevent tokens from being replayed and reused for several hours after it was expired. So that part, along with the dynamic discovery of the endpoints for the identity provider. So one of the endpoints that are crucial for token validation is the JWKS endpoint that ensures that when identity providers rotates the key pairs that are using for the digital signature encryption, then the latest keys are provided, the public keys are provided on the JWKS endpoint, and that ensures that the JWT validation policy always works with the latest keys that are published. So that's part of the API gateway responsibility, if you will. So that's one of the things that the API management APIM can do, or if you're implementing your own gateway, that's something the gateway must do. It will always get the metadata endpoint from your IDC provider to ensure it has the latest keys and the latest metadata from the identity provider. And notice also that that fine-grained access control is crucial, because you have the claims that come with the token can be validated through policies. So we'll have a validate JWT policy demo coming shortly, in which we'll go deeper into how to create a policy with APIM that will validate the token claims and therefore authorize the request to the backend service. Now, what happens when your intelligent applications don't talk to IDC? They're not prepared for IDC. They may have, excuse me, they may have, they need to use a different mechanism for authentication on your end users. So in the past, we've seen a lot of applications that use client digital certificates. Is this an option? So if you were to use Azure OpenAI directly or another generative AI service directly, a lot of them are not prepared to use digital client certificates. So that won't be an option without the use of an API gateway. So in this case, if you have client digital certificates and you want to implement mutual TLS authentication by requesting a client certificate from the intelligent application to authenticate that HTTP request, the API gateway can assume that role and ensure that the intelligent applications present a client certificate as part of the TLS handshake. And you can also implement a policy in the case of APIM to validate that client certificate. So you can validate the fields on the client certificate, the certificate authority, and so on. In this case, we also recommend the use of Azure Key Vault if you're issuing client certificates for your intelligent applications to ensure you're rotating the certificate properly and increase the security of handling the digital certificate, storing the digital certificate for your applications, and providing the latest digital certificate for authorizing access to the API services. So in this case, even though it's not depicted in the picture, using an Azure Key Vault or another Key Vault, we of course recommend Azure because it's one of the most used security services in Azure. That will allow you the issuance of client certificates for your intelligent applications, as well as the rotation of the client certificates and the API management then can have a policy to validate those client certificates that are past part of the TLS handshake. Okay, so let's now look at one of our most interesting demos. So we'll look at the validation of identity tokens on the Azure API management, the policies we'll use, and how to grant authorization to the backend Azure OpenAI. Bapa, over to you.
Sure, Lizette. So if you see my screen, that if you so in a previous demo we grabbed the token, but that token needs to be validated in the Azure API Management gateway. So to do that, as Lizette, as you explained, we have used the way I did was setting up the policy. So this is like you can set up the policy from the portal here. You can create the policy fragments and add the policy fragments as well. So there are many ways. So if you see this is the policy validate JWT header, and as Lizette explained, it just validate the well-known endpoint of the OpenID configuration. So it is validating that that this well-known endpoint it's getting the keys and stuff from the KID and keys from this well-known endpoint, and then validates the token, the signature, and all stuff. And here you can mention the different like you can check the different claims from the token. Like as part of this demo, I check the audiences and the
Mhm.
issuer. If you see that this is my issuer and this is my audience, but you can check your scope, you can check roles and all stuff. So let's do that one demo. So basically, if I see this, let me grab a new access token. Use token, and I'll be calling one of the with the manage identity part, but in the later part of in the last demo I'll show you that how we configured the manage identity or keys in the policy. But as for this demo, you can see that I'm just calling it and it grabs the token, and if I send it, and if you see my body in the API in the Azure OpenAI, it has a role, and the content is hello. So here is what we call our LLM endpoints, right? There are, like in your real life application, it will be little bit different, because you have to pass the system prompt and your messages, your regular data. If you are building the RAG app, you will be passing the more data into the API as part of your body, and then you need to check the claims and tokens and all kind of stuff, the max token and stuff. So we suggest you to follow the other learned live to handle the token validation, the load balancing part. But as part of this demo, we are focusing on how you can authenticate your Azure OpenAI through the APIM service. So now if you see the console, if you see here, as you see that authorization, it just passed the bearer token. And if I would have not grabbed a token and I would have not passed this bearer token, it would have come as a 401 unauthorized. So this is what it is. My middle layer in the APIM gateway, it is validating our application's token using this bearer token, and it validates the claim and all stuff. And as you see, I get the 200 back, and I get the response back from the Azure OpenAI instance. But the way APIM connects to the Azure OpenAI, for this case, it is a managed identity. For other case, it might be with a key that I will show you in the next demo. But as part of this demo, now you are showing that validate JWT. But the other thing, what I wanted to quickly show you here is if you see the header, and I'm passing this one more key, one more header value, which is OCP APIM subscription key. As you know that our Azure APIM management, it supports the subscription key. So we recommend to use the subscription key along with other authentication mechanism. It's not just, you should not use subscription key alone for your authentication, but this subscription key is a great way of segregate if your APIs, if you wanted to track your usage part, that which API is used for what, you can use that, and monetization part. So basically, our API management, you can have a products. You can, like, as you see that I created a custom and internal products of AOAI, and I can add my own APIs. Like if you see AOAI internal, I added my APIs, this my manage identity, and the other one is with the keys, and the subscription can be added with the products, and you can call the subscription, you can call the APIM API directly with the subscription key. That's an optional, but we recommend you to use the subscription key for if you wanted to track your usage part. The other thing, Lizette, what you explained is the certificate part.
Yes.
So here is so let me go here. So this is what the certificate, you can add it, you can add your key vault as well as your custom certificate. So this can also, this is the feature inbuilt within Azure API management, which can validate your client, your web apps client certificate. And also it can validate it can pass the certificate to the other your backend services, but not for the Azure OpenAI, because Azure OpenAI does not support the certificate. It only supports the API key and the managed identity. But for your front end to your API, it can support the certificates. We are not showing as a demo, but this feature is available. You can add the certificates in Key Vault and add it here, and your client tab can pass the certificates. So as
Great.
part of this demo, Lizard, this is I have, and next demo I will show the details of the managed identities and keys. Over to you.
Okay, and one thing with regards to this demo, so the validate JWT policy, you can have it. We have examples of this validate JWT policy on our documentation. So notice that we're using this type of policy and validating the claims. In this case, there's audience and issuer, but if you have application roles or user roles, you can definitely add those claims on that section of the policy to ensure you have the proper values on those claims, and a token that won't have those claims present or has the wrong values on the tokens, then the API gateway will issue an unauthorized 401 right away. So that authorization, you can fine-grain your claims and fine-grain your authorization mechanism based on this policy. And this policy can also be reused to validate several intelligent applications, the tokens issued to several intelligent applications. That way, you're offloading the token validation that is crucial for the security of your solution to the gateway rather than having it on the backend service and adding a lot more to the complexity of the solution. So that this simplifies quite a bit the security and ensures that security is consistent for all your intelligent applications.
Exactly. Yep. And yes, I mean, we have good documentation on this validate JWT. You can check that, and you know how to use different claims here, and you can validate all the claims listed as you mentioned.
Awesome. So let's look at what if you have how would you do authentication with the Azure OpenAI service using a managed identity. So as we mentioned before, managed identities are the service provided by EntraID that it's a lot of the Azure services support the use of managed identities for authentication and authorization purposes. So in this case, you assign a managed identity to the API gateway in
So I think
Azure.
Lizette,
Oh,
the
okay.
your PPTs are not yet in the.
Loaded. Oh, okay.
So Todd, can you switch over to Lizette's screen, please? Yeah,
Okay,
now
now
it's good.
we have it. Okay,
Hmm.
awesome.
Hmm.
Sorry about that, folks. It was a glitch on the coordination, but here we are. So when you have the Azure OpenAI service, you also want to guarantee that the backend is called from the API management service and not from another caller, right? And the same, then how can you guarantee that? Well, managed identity is one of the preferred ways to ensure a service can obtain an access token from EntraID that represents that service or that client uniquely, so that it represents that particular service and no other, and that managed identity can obtain an access token for a backend API, in this case, Azure OpenAI service. There are two options available. So you can have a system assigned managed identity that's tied to the life cycle of the particular Azure resource that is assigned to. So there is a one-to-one relationship between the managed identity and the resource it belongs to. If the resource is the provision in Azure, the system assigned managed identity is also the provision in Azure. And that managed identity allows the client service to request an access token to authenticate to a backend API of RESTful service. In this case, you can also have a user assigned managed identity. Now, the relationship is one to many, so you can have a user assigned managed identity that can grant authorization to multiple resources. We have managed identity explained thoroughly in our public documentation, so I encourage you to look at, review our public documentation on managed identity. But notice that this can guarantee a secure communication between your API management service and the Azure OpenAI service that supports managed identity. Now, what happens when you cannot authenticate using a managed identity? Let's say you have a generative AI service that may be hosted elsewhere or simply cannot support managed identities. In that case, you can revert to the use of a key, and we're going to see a little bit more about the use of API keys next. Now, API keys are also a way to control and monitor APIs that are associated with generative AI services. And it's highly likely that if you have a generative AI service that is not associated or cannot support EntraID tokens or may not support OIDC, then you can still use API keys to communicate to that API. In that case, the API key will be part of the HTTP request header and as an API key header, and it will go into every HTTP request. So what we do in this case is guarantee that the API management service, the communication with the generative AI service, is using API keys. And that way, the API keys is a unique identifier of the API gateway, and it will allow you to control and monitor the API associated with the generative AI service. It can also allow you to throttle incoming requests. Also, you can use name value pairs for the API keys. You can control the rate of the request, the total request transfers based on API keys, and that way control limit the rate of high volume calls by using implementing quotas on API management. Now, these API keys, we can also store them securely. If we can store them in Key Vault if we need to, so that would be a way to securely implement that. I think I went one back. I'm sorry. In here, we're not depicting Azure Key Vault, but notice that that's a way to store securely API keys and then present them on the request. One thing that I wanted to note with the use of Azure Key Vault and generative AI services is that notice this is between the API management service and the generative AI service. So the Key Vault could store securely these keys. So that's a way to authorize and comply with that authorization requirement. Now, I didn't mention on the previous slide with the use of managed identities that in this case, may lose traceability of who initiated the initial request, like which intelligent application and which user, because you're using a managed identity that represents the API gateway rather than the intelligent application. In this case, we recommend to shift left and increase the monitoring and tracing on the API management service so you can correlate the incoming request with the actual request that is issued to the backend API that uses managed identity. And that way you can have the traceability you need for auditing purposes.
Yeah, Lizette, and subscription key can be used here as I showed, so the subscription
Absolutely.
key can be used with the every request, or you can give the subscription to your different app, different intelligent app. So you can track your usage in the API management itself based on your subscription.
Great. Yes, that's definitely a great way to correlate the initial requests with the backend requests. Now let's do another demo. And in this case, we'll look at authenticating using managed identity and authenticating using API keys with Azure API Management. Bapa, over to you.
Sure, Lizette. So as I showed before that our Azure OpenAI, it exposed the keys and the endpoints, So you see that in the OpenAI we have the keys, but as we are explaining in the session, we don't want to give these keys to our app owners directly. Instead, we wanted to manage it in a middle place, right? So that's why if you see APIM has a named values pair, and if I add it here, if you see it supports a secret and key vault as well. So you can have the keys, API keys stored in a key vault and mention the key vault. But part of the demo, I use the secret. So you see the type secret, and you can show the values and stuff. So that I have used it. And after creating the named values, if I go to API, if you see API with key, this is my Azure OpenAI endpoint, and I have the validate JWT. So you have to have this policy to be added. So this is the set header. So as you see that in the set header policy, so what I'm just doing is here Lizette is like, I'm just setting an extra header while I'm going, like when APIM transferring the request, passing through the request to the backend to the Azure OpenAI endpoint, it's just adding the header as an API key. So the API key has been added, and as Lizette, as you are explaining, so OpenAI, if the customer is using the Azure OpenAI, they may not use the API key. But if you are using the other AI services, or you are using your custom LLM, which does not support any other authentication other than API key, so this is the way to go. So you can have your API management, have this set header, and pass this one. So now if I go here, this is my postman. Now I'll grab a and you see this, I'm calling this endpoint API with key because I have created two API endpoint in my APIM. One is API with key, the other one is the API with a managed identity. It's nothing but the suffix in the API management. I'm passing this one. I'm getting a subscription key. So getting my authentication token, proceed, use token. And as you see that I have the same thing, body, hello, and then I'll send it. And you see this response comes back, hello, I may assist you. So as part of this API call, I'm not using the manager entity, I'm only using the key. But for my next API, which is the API which I imported from the same OpenAI specs, I imported, and it has the same APIs. The only difference is if you see the manager identity, if I go to the policies, I don't. Oh, this is the keys. 1 second. Okay. So as you see that this is, you don't see the set header for the API key anymore. What you see that you see only two different two different policies. One is the authentication manage identity, and the resources is https cognitive services.azure.com, and the output token variable is this. So what it basically does is that I have to enable the manage identity for my API management service. So if you scroll down, as Lizette, as you explained, there are two ways to enable the manage identities within APIM, and it's very similar for other Azure services as well, for your app service and for other services. So it's a system assigned and the user assigned. So system assigned manage identities are basically, it's a system assigned as long as the life cycle of this service exists. This manage identity, this service principal exists. Otherwise, if you delete this API, if I delete this API instance, this service principal will go away as well. So the other thing is the user assigned. You can have your own user assigned. You can create a your own service principal and then assign to the to this APIM as well. So for this demo, I use this system assigned manage identities. And if you see, let me copy this. And after this, what I have to do is I have to assign these manage identities with my Azure OpenAI workspace. So if I go here, access control, role assignment, and as you can see that. So what I did was I just you just need to add the your manage identity. So this is basically the APIM enterprise. This is the manage identity for my APIM, and I add it as with the proper role, which is the cognitive services user. So this is very key part. So what we are doing here is we enable the manage identities within APIM. We assign the manage identities with Azure OpenAI, and then we implemented the policies in our API so that our APIM grabs the token from the Entra ID using those managed identities and pass the token to the Azure OpenAI using with the authorization claim. So if you see the policies again, so what it does is it grabs this authentication managed identity resources. So it creates the so APIM. If I just remove this token, this policy from this one, what APIM would do is it just pass the token from the front end and pass it to the back end, which would not work because your Azure OpenAI does not know your token grabbed by your front end application. But what as policy this policy is doing, it is overriding the authorization claim. It is overriding the BRR token passed by the front end app. Now, overriding by what? Overriding by a new token grabbed by this APIM, grabbed by this APIM service for my Azure OpenAI. So, using the managed identity system assigned managed identity. So, this is very critical part to understand because we are overriding this BRR token in as part as using this policy and so that Azure OpenAI recognize that that token grabbed by the APIM because I already assigned that APIM managed identity to Azure OpenAI, and it allows to call the API.
Great. So
Now, if I
that's
yeah,
no, that said header, as you mentioned, is the critical part. So notice the other policy that had the set header for the API key, but this one, it has the access token that was issued to the managed identity for that particular service. So the creation of the managed identity, then assigning the proper role to the backend service are the first steps. And then this authorization header that should be on the request from API management to the backend services is the other part that is key. And that's guaranteed with that snippet of code that you showed on the policy.
that is right,
So
Lizette. So this is what I wanted to show you, that from the front end, like if I open up from your front end application, it really does not matter because what I will do is that get new access token uh, and open it. So this is the benefit of having the Lizette, as you explained, benefit of having the API management gateway, because your front end app now grabs the token using the Entra ID front end app registration, and I have the token. And as you see that it's just, if I send it, it gives me the result. And if I console go here, and if you see, this BRR token is nothing but the token by the token grabbed by this authorization from the Entra ID, but this token been replaced by APIM when it goes to the Azure OpenAI, because the Azure OpenAI using the system assigned managed identity, it grabs the a new token and sends back to the Azure OpenAI, and that's how it validated. And that's why we have an enormous benefit of having this API management service in front of Azure OpenAI, so that in one place you can have all of these things. You are managing your key-based authentication, your managed identity. Basically, if you have multiple Azure hosted intelligent app, you don't you are not assigning your, even if you are going for managed identity route, you are just using one managed identity for your APIM gateway. You are not assigning multiple Azure hosted intelligent app managed identity to the Azure OpenAI directly. APIM is the middleware here. You just enable your managed identity in the APIM, associate with the Azure OpenAI workspace, and implement as many as Azure hosted intelligent apps or your custom app based on your different authentication method.
great, and that way you minimize the administrative overhead because you have a single system assigned managed identity for your API gateway rather than a proliferation of managed identities. So that's key to know. And also, we want to stress that you have to shift left in this case and increase the auditing and monitoring at the API management level, because it's a different token altogether what is issued for the request to the backend. But as we mentioned before, having the subscription key, and it's a way to correlate the initial request coming from the intelligent app with the backend request that is issued from the API management to the backend service. And that way you can trace from beginning to end the sequence of requests that are done by the intelligent app and that the requests that are received by the backend.
That is right.
Great.
That's a great call
Mhm.
out. And we do have a Learn Live coming for the monitoring on Azure OpenAI, so that should be a great
Mhm.
information, wealth of information will be shared. So hopefully our customers can see that Learn Live as well.
Definitely, they'll be able to benefit from it.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's then summarize what we've seen so far. So let's first, we introduced the API management service or an API gateway, and we saw the drawbacks we have to use the Azure OpenAI authentication mechanisms that come out of the box. So we only have the EntraID and API keys. But if we have external identity providers or we have disparate intelligent applications with other ways to authenticate, like client credentials, or external identity providers, then by introducing an API gateway with defined roles, we can implement alternative authentication mechanisms that will ensure our solutions are more secure and also implement better alternative solutions for authentication. In this case, we show you how to authenticate using EntraID, how to manage keys, how to, if you have applications or generative AI services that only use API keys as a mechanism for authentication, you can still use an external or EntraID identity provider to implement OIDC and federation identity, and then rely on the API gateway to manage the keys for it could use a key vault as well, key vault service, to then present the keys to the other LLM services that you may be accessing. So there are several advantages to the API gateway pattern. We show you demos with the API management service, how to register a client application, how to register the Azure OpenAI service, the endpoints provided by API management. We also show you how to validate the job tokens issued by EntraID or by an external identity provider. You can also use the same policy with other OIDC providers. We also show you how to use managed identities to authenticate the API management service with the backend Azure OpenAI service. Excuse me. How to use a system assigned managed identity, how to modify the policy to pass the access token provided or granted to the managed identity to the backend. And we also show you in the case of API key-based authentication, how to modify the policy as well to pass an API key to the backend service. So that way you have several solutions that are more secure by implementing an API gateway pattern. You have policies that can fine-grain the authorization mechanisms by either um, uh, ensuring you have the proper claims on your job tokens or ensuring you have proper keys provided. You can do throttling, monitoring, and much more using an API gateway pattern and Azure API Management Service. So we hope this webinar is educational, and we hope you learned about Azure OpenAI identity and security, how to use an API gateway implementation and use APIM to create a more secure solution. Again, this is the URL where you can see a collection that has resources for you to go deeper into these subjects. And feel free to send us questions about the subject, or if you want a subsequent session, then definitely you can reach out and request one. And notice that you can have other learn episodes provided by fast track engineers, and you also have the recordings of previous episodes on this URL. So check it out and let us know if you have questions. We'll be happy to help.
Perfect. Thank you, Lizette. And thanks everyone who ever watching. I think since more and more people are developing the Azure intelligent, like the intelligent application connecting to the Azure OpenAI or other LLM services, hopefully this session was beneficial for those people who are looking for guidance of implementing the authentication and the authorization and the security for their application connecting to the LLM service, including Azure OpenAI.
Great.